There'll be silence on my left. There'll be silence on my left. I call the honourable member for Herbert.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on the findings of the independent review into the Nauru riots?
I call the honourable Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for Herbert. I'm pleased that he's asked me this question today about the report that was released on Saturday evening. I've noticed that I've had no questions, Madam Speaker, from those opposite about the Nauru riots that occurred on their watch. And that report was released on Saturday night, and I haven't heard any calls for that report to be released any earlier. They seem to have wanting to just whitewash their history while they were in government. Remember, that was a history while they're in government, and their border protection record was 50,000 plus arrivals. There was over 800 vessels, and as we know, the tragedy of over 1,100 deaths. That was the record. But on one particular night, on the 19th of July, there was a riot on Nauru. And when you read the findings of that independent report that was commissioned a week or so after that event by the previous minister, what you read is that the report outlines what happens when a government is dragged kicking and screaming to implement a policy they don't believe in. Because that was the record of the previous government when it came to offshore processing. Year after year after year, in opposition, the coalition said you needed to restore offshore processing, and year after year after year they denied it. They said you shouldn't do it, it wouldn't have an outcome, it wouldn't help. They also said that you couldn't turn boats back, and they also said temporary protection visas were things that shouldn't be implemented. Now, they still believe the latter two. They still believe those, despite the success that particularly our operations at sea are having. They said that could never work, and that clearly is working, Madam Speaker, because it's 68 days now, Madam Speaker, 68 days since there's been a successful people smuggling venture to this country. Now, Madam Speaker, in that report it said $60 million worth of damage to taxpayer-funded services and facilities were implemented, occurred on that evening. $60 million. It found that the planning of those centres was poorly conceived by the previous government, poorly conceived to the point of failing a duty of care. It says there was hands-off oversight, Madam Speaker. It says that the intelligence response failed up the chain. So when intelligence may have existed, there was no ability to respond to that up the chain, Madam Speaker. It said there was a lack of clarity relating to the powers of police and security officers on that evening. It says there was no preemptive exercise of authority undertaken to prevent the sorts of incidents that were emerging there, and it said staffing levels were inadequate to deal with large-scale non-compliant behaviour. Now, Madam Speaker, we are now dealing with the results of another very, very serious incident. And many of the design flaws, Madam Speaker, that were present on Nauru were present in the putting together of that facility on Manus. Madam Speaker, when we are dragged kicking and screaming to implement a policy as the previous government was doing, then accidents will happen.
I call the honourable member for Corio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, and I refer to the minister's previous answer relating to Australian government responsibility for offshore detention facilities. Yesterday, the minister reported to the House that he had not personally spoken with the official on Manus Island in charge of the detention facility since September last year. Why does the minister run from responsibility for the Manus Island detention facility?
I call the honourable Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Madam Speaker, thank you for the call, and thank you to the member for his question. I outlined yesterday to this House, when I had the personal meeting with the operations manager appointed by the Chief Migration Officer from Papua New Guinea, and that was in September. That's right, that's when it was. And on a daily basis, my department and agencies work with that operations manager. Now, Madam Speaker, I know those opposite like to meddle in the operational affairs of their agencies and give them all sorts of directions, but, Madam Speaker, is the opposition seriously suggesting that on a day-to-day basis ministers should direct the operations of those centres? Now, Madam Speaker, I have a highly competent secretary, the same secretary that serviced the four ministers, well, two ministers previous on that side of the House, 3 I should say, and that secretary, together with my department, works together with the service providers at that centre. But one of the things we did do, Madam Speaker, when we came to government was this, and on that visit that I made in September of last year with General Molan, it became absolutely crystal clear that the situation was not right on Manus Island, that the security situation on Manus Island was deficient. And as a result, Madam Speaker, the first thing I did was to instruct General Molan to do a force protection assessment review on Manus Island. And over the last 5 months, we have been filling the $1.2 billion black hole of inadequate funding and support for an under-resourced, understaffed, undercapitalised centre that was put in place by the previous government. The previous government that appointed all the service providers and all the arrangements for those service providers who were on watch that night. So, Madam Speaker, the review into the Manus Island incident will take its course. It will look at all of these matters. It will review all of these matters. It will review the decisions taken by the previous government as well as the decisions taken by this government. In February, that included sending 130 additional security officers to Manus Island to deal with the brewing incident. And I know this, Madam Speaker, as terrible as the events were of that night last week, I know without the actions taken by this government over the last 5 months to clean up the mess on Manus Island that was left by the previous government for a policy they were dragged kicking and screaming to implement, if it were not for those actions, then the situation would have been far worse.
I call the honourable member for Hindmarch.